This is America Daily, bringing you the best in truthful news updates and in-depth reports happening now.
On today's episode, recap of the G7 summit, huge drug bust in Mexico, and the fires in Brazil. Is it a climate catastrophe or fake news? Welcome to America Daily. I'm your host, Jessica.
And I'm Matt.
The Group of Seven summit, or G7, wrapped up Monday. The US and Japan made a new trade deal, and G7 leaders issued a declaration on Monday committing to fair trade. French President Emmanuel Macron released the declaration at the end of the three-day summit in France. He said they're all committed to open and fair global trade and the stability of the global economy. U.S. trade negotiators Steve Mnuchin and Larry Kudlow echoed that sentiment.
I was in the economics and trade meeting this morning, 2 hours. You know what? The vibes were good. There are always disagreements. You know, you've got high-powered leaders here, and there may be tactical disagreements, but every single one of them, I'm going to say this again, every single one of those leaders agreed that something's got to be done with China's unfair trading practices. Every single one expressed support on that very key point. So I'm just saying, the contentiousness and the arguments that some people were writing about 24, 40 hours ago are not happening.
But the British Prime Minister specifically said he opposes tariffs.
Hold on, one second. Yes,
The
ma'am.
British Prime Minister said he opposes tariffs.
Well, again, different people may have different views on tariffs and how we're executing, but we had a terrific meeting with Boris Johnson this morning. He couldn't have been more supportive on there are issues with China. He supports us on these issues with China. And by the way, we're expecting a terrific U.S.-UK trade agreement. This is something Ambassador Lighthizer and his counterpart are going to start working on, and we expect to be able to do a lot more business with the UK.
Can I ask a question about that?
Sure.
Okay, just to follow up on that, let me just make an add-on. Boris Johnson's a free trader, and expressed that view. I am a free trader. I believe my secretary is a free trader also. President Trump has said
free and fair reciprocal trade.
There you go.
Tell him the president proposed the three options.
zeros that surfaced in something I wrote a year ago and wrote it again Saturday. The president repeated it today. His vision here is zero tariffs, zero non-tariff barriers, and zero subsidies. And so when Boris Johnson and others say they're free traders, the president believes that too, free, fair, and reciprocal trade.
Macron's declaration came hours after President Trump announced that China is eager to make a deal. And the previous day, the White House said President Trump might have regretted not raising tariffs on China even more. The president has accused China of unfair trade practices.
Sometimes, you got to take some stern
Because we don't
measures.
have free trade with them. That's why.
right.
So we do not have free trade. It's a one-way street. They have free entrance into our markets, our investments, our companies, and we do not have the same thing there. That's the only reason why we are in this situation with China. If China would agree to a fair and balanced relationship, we would sign that deal in a second.
Okay. Research fellow James Roberts from the Heritage Foundation told the Epoch Times that he thinks the other G7 leaders are privately happy that the U.S. has taken the lead in standing up to China's unfair trade practices. And Simon Lester from the Cato Institute told the Epoch Times that Macron's declaration was, quote, good diplomatic language just to make everybody happy. Lester also said that the U.S. is not only fighting a trade war with China, but also with Europe, Canada, Mexico, and Japan. Another interesting thing is that President Trump thinks Russian President Vladimir Putin should be in next year's summit. When Russia invaded Ukraine, it was kicked out of the G8.
I mean, I think it's definitely important to try to make out a good deal that's going to benefit really both sides between us and China. And I hope that this can be resorted as a peaceful thing and not turn into something far worse, because I wouldn't be surprised if it did. I'm going to be honest here. The president is doing this to make things better between all the countries, I think, and make it, so that we profit better and even help them profit better. Just find some fair deals that's going to work for both of us. I thought it was really interesting that he wanted to include Russia in the next summit, and maybe that can be a good thing down the road. That's just my opinion. I don't know.
What I think is interesting is that they keep saying China wants to make a deal, but according to some experts, like I think it was General Robert Spalding, they say that China is actually trying to delay until after the 2020 election because they want someone other than Trump to be elected, because President Trump has been so tough on China on trade issues, whereas like previous presidents have pretty much let China do whatever they want. So that's pretty interesting to me. We'll see if they can make a deal. Here's a clip from the show Zooming In with Simone Gao.
Do you detect an attitude change on the Chinese part during the last few months? I mean, if you look back 8 months at the G20 in Argentina, China appeared to be very eager to reach a deal at that time. Xi Jinping laid out all the details himself, which gave the American side the impression that he was really sincere and he really wanted a deal. So have things changed? Does China still want a trade deal with the U.S.?
I don't think China ever wanted a deal. It's just, I think before they thought they could convince the president that they wanted a deal, and in order to continue negotiations without actually delivering a deal. I think now, especially after imposition of the latest round of tariffs, the Chinese Communist Party understands that the president has figured out what their game is. And so what they're going to do is have progressively harder rhetoric that seeks to essentially portray the president as the bad guy in the negotiations in order to diminish support moving into the 2020 elections, in particular in those disaffected areas like the farmers.
Well, do you think the president need a trade deal with China for his re-election?
Well, that's a very good question. I can't predict how the elections will turn out. I will tell you that for the United States of America, if we want to remain a democratic republic, a deal that essentially allows the Chinese Communist Party to continue its actions that are essentially eroding both our economic prosperity and our democratic freedoms would be enormously damaging for the American people. So, I would hope that the president, looking for the long-term good of the nation, would do what's right, regardless of what the outcome of the 2020 elections is. As I noted in my op-ed, that the ability for U.S. corporations to offshore manufacturing in areas of low labor protections and low environmental protections really creates a disadvantage for the U.S. in terms of domestic investment, and it really puts American workers at a disadvantage with other countries when their own American corporations aren't willing to invest in job-sustaining, investments in the United States. In other words, the president could actually help the situation by just saying, okay, we realize that China desires to be a non-market-based economy, and then by virtue of the fact that they will continue to be a non-market-based economy, that we are going to essentially treat them as a non-market-based economy as a permanent policy.
Does that mean the tariffs would be permanent, as you wrote in your article?
Right, and not just make the tariffs permanent, but also create the same kind of, fair and reciprocal conditions that currently exist. In other words, there are many companies, particularly large tech companies, that cannot have a presence in China. I would say that, that probably should be mirrored with Chinese companies. In other words, Alibaba, Baidu, Tencent should not be able to have a presence in the United States or WeChat or any of those other companies unless reciprocal favor is given to U.S. companies. And there's no sense from the Chinese side that that's going to be the case. And so things like that, where China essentially denies access to its economy for U.S. firms ought to be reciprocated by the U.S. towards Chinese firms. Another one is Alipay. MasterCard and Visa have both been trying to get into the Chinese market, and they've been prevented, yet Alipay is allowed to be in the U.S. market. So there's a number of these asymmetric relationships in business and finance and trade and the economy that really advantages Chinese firms to the detriment of U.S. firms. So I think that is an area that will have to be looked at. And then it needs to be mirrored across the free world, because it's not just impacting the United States, it's impacting other democracies as well. And it's impacting those democracies, the companies in those democracies' ability to compete on a fair and level playing field. In other words, America needs to reestablish a zone of economic and trade and financial relationships that actually, aspire to have fair and reciprocal relationships, and cut out those nations that refuse to play by the rules.
Right. I understand what you said, but don't you think the business circle, the market, will be scared of this idea?
Well, I think once they understand what the rules are, then they can begin to adjust their supply chains and their business models to address that. There's a lot of fear by saying essentially that you're going to have two large economic zones, one free and one closed. I think if successfully executed, the free world has a very, very large economic capacity, and it's a very large market. And so to the extent that you can enlist other democracies in an effort to create a very fair and reciprocal trading environment, then U.S. companies will be able to thrive in that environment, because then it'll be just on their ability to be competitive. And American workers will be involved in that, because American workers are productive when given the chance, when they are faced with other nations that have similar labor protections and environmental protections.
Right. So if the U.S. makes the tariffs permanent, the U.S. company would be forced to move their supply chain out of China. That would force the U.S. and Chinese economy to decouple. That's the idea, right?
Yeah, we really have no choice, because otherwise our companies and our workers, our country can't be competitive economically. If we're constantly in this environment where China uses globalization for its own advantage to the detriment of others, I think what you have to come to the conclusion is either China is going to play by the rules of openness in a globalized world, or they're not. And quite frankly, they state both in their Chinese Communist Party constitution and in document number 9 that they are absolutely determined to maintain a closed system so that the Chinese Communist Party can maintain control of China. And that requires that they not participate on a fair and open basis in the globalized world. They have to. Their system is designed to take advantage of globalization, and they can't change that unless they change, their system.
You think the odds are that someone else will be elected?
The president has a lot of support from Republicans, and the 2020 Democrat hopefuls have generally embraced pretty radical ideas, which it seems like will alienate a lot of moderates. So it'll be interesting to see what happens.
Going back to the G Summit, so next year it's going to be in Florida here in the States, the G7. And I have President Trump on Twitter, so I get his tweets. And I just got one that said that the media is accusing his property where it's going to be hosted has bed bug issues right now. So that's like their kind of first move towards trying to, downplay what's going to happen with the G7 summit. And of course, the president looked into it, and there aren't any bed bugs, but that's their that's their first of, I'm sure, what's going to be many ploys on trying to bash anything that the president does, because that's what they do nowadays.
Coming up, a ridiculously large drug bust in Mexico.
So apparently there was a huge bust of fentanyl from that originated out of Shanghai, China, heading towards to Mexico. The Mexico government announced the bust of this in the state of, and I'm going to try to say this word right, Michoacan, which is part of western Mexico. Local media outlets initially reported it weighed nearly 25 tons, which is 51,000 pounds, and it came from Shanghai, China. That's a lot of drugs, like a lot of drugs. Uh, I mean, I'm never hearing about, cocaine busts or meth busts. I've never heard that amount. It's a lot. They found the cargo in the container of a flagged vessel from Denmark, and they took a sample of the powder. It tested positive for fentanyl. Despite initial media reports, the government said the weight is still being determined. So it's about 25 tons. I guess they don't know the exact amount, but there's still, it's a very, very, very large amount of drugs.
There was another report I saw that said that amount of fentanyl powder could kill 7 billion people, which would be most of the world's population. I don't know if that's true or not, or how people would even figure that out, but even just getting a whiff of that powder could kill you. I mean, you hear reports about that happening.
That's strong if you could just get a whiff of it. Ugh, I can't even imagine. According to Breitbart, Texas, law enforcement officials, fentanyl powder can be easily mass-produced into the black market oxycodone, or as it's known, Mexican oxy. The pills are deadly and are often blamed for contributing to the opioid overdose crisis in the U.S. So this shipment was going to a drug cartel just so they can distribute it in the U.S. because that's what they want to do. They want to make their money, and that's how they make their money.
There's been a large increase in fentanyl pills being confiscated in the past 2 years alone. Arizona's DEA announced that over 1 million fentanyl pills have been seized so far in 2019's fiscal year alone, just in Arizona.
Which back last year in 2018, there was only about 380,000 pills. And then in 2016, only 20,000 pills. So that's a significant increase of the amount of pills being distributed in the U.S. I think it's a pretty good thing that they were able to find these 25 tons of fentanyl, don't you?
Yes, definitely. What's interesting to me about this is that the shipment was going to the cartels in Mexico to be made into Mexican oxy pills to be presumably sent up into the United States. So how do they get those pills into the United States in the first place? You'd think they would be crossing the border with them illegally.
I don't know how they're able to move that kind of stuff across the border with the checkpoints. I don't know if maybe, the security, I'm not saying they're doing a bad job, but maybe there's other extra ways they need to take to find these drugs. And honestly, the only thing I've seen about it being sneaky was on TV shows like Breaking Bad and stuff. They were basically like, they would have like their shipping trucks and they would remove the floor of the shipping truck and they'd be under there, or they'd put them in the tires or whatever. But I mean, I don't know how they do it, if it's different in real life or not. But yeah, it seems like they're able to still somehow get it across into the States, across the border. Now, I mean, I guess they could put it on boats and take it around and come in through some ports or something. I don't know. But yeah, it seems like it's still pretty easy for them to get those drugs in, and maybe the wall would help with that. I'm not sure. So there's definitely a lot of details that we probably don't know about, and that's why it's kind of hard to determine whether or not the wall is a good issue or is a good solution to a ever-growing problem with our country and Mexico.
I just wanted to add that all those numbers about pills being seized were only for the state of Arizona alone. So just imagine what the numbers are for the entire country. Coming up, fires in the Amazon. Is it a climate catastrophe or fake news? In the past week or so, there have been a lot of reports about devastating fires in the Amazon rainforest in Brazil. Here's a clip from CNN from August 22nd.
Right now, the Amazon rainforest is being consumed by fire. In fact, there's an 80% increase in fires just over the last year alone. And this comes, of course, after the hottest July our planet has ever seen. I want you to take a look at these pictures showing the smoke from space. These are images from high above covering huge parts of South America. Now, this isn't an act of God. It's farmers and ranchers intentionally destroying the land for more development. The Amazon basin is, of course, known as the lungs of the world. It provides 20% of the oxygen for the entire planet. But Brazil's new right-wing leader, Jair Bolsonaro, is not bothered by the destruction. In fact, he's mocking environmentalists who warn of the long-term damage that will make the climate crisis even worse.
So have you been seeing the news about this?
I have. I've been seeing a lot of stuff on Facebook about it, and I've been seeing just popping up through the internet when I'm researching on the internet. And, at first when I heard it, I was like, wow, I can't believe it's this serious. But after digging a little further, I've come to learn that it's really not out of what normally is going on in the Amazon as far as like fires go. So I was watching the Tim Cast episode. He was talking about it. And something that I found extremely interesting is he had a map pulled up, and it showed like where the fires were and stuff. And all the fires, they were on like farmland in the Amazon or like areas where there's not really that much forest. So it's not really, the forest itself is really not on fire. It's the farmers around the forest that are burning their fields so that they can start planting for the next harvest. Which is something that they do commonly.
What I think is interesting about the story is that a lot of the reporting on this is made to make you afraid. There was a CNN headline titled, "Amazon Rainforest Burning at Record Rate." And then there was a New York Daily News article titled, "The Amazon Rainforest is Burning, Be Afraid." The original data for this was from Brazil's National Institute for Space Research. That seems reliable, right? But actually, lots of people have been saying that the data is not reliable and that this is fake news to incite fear about climate catastrophes.
Yeah, like I said, it's really just the farmland that's burning. And another thing is that there's fires that go on during the same point every year in the Amazon. And again, it might just be because of the farmers, but I mean, even just the forest itself, it does burn a little bit every now and then, usually at the end of July into August and September. And there's actually, it's down lower, the percentage of fires is down lower this year than it has been in previous years. And like, for instance, I mean, a lot of the stuff that I got was from the research that Tim did on the Timcast. He was showing maps of previous years where there were fires, and like I think it was 2016, or no, it might have been 2014. There was so many more fires in the Amazon than there is today, and yet back then no one said anything about it. Even in like the early 2000s, there was a diagram, and it showed where we were at in 2019. It was relatively low. And in 2003, it was extremely high how many fires there were there. But you know what? We didn't hear about it back then. So why are we hearing about this now? That's the big question. It just sounds more like agenda pushing to me than anything.
Another important thing to mention is that the image that was most shared with this story was a NASA satellite image. It was also in a New York Times article too, and it showed a bunch of smoke. But what they did not share was the caption from that image, which said, quote, "As of August 16, 2019, an analysis of NASA satellite data indicated that total fire activity across the Amazon basin this year has been close to the average in comparison to the past 15 years." So they're saying that it's close to the average. And so if they intentionally left that caption off saying that this year's fire activity is close to average, then people are going to worry because the picture does show a lot of smoke.
Yeah, you have to go and find the sources of the information because you're not the news media that you're most likely reading or watching or listening to. They're not giving all the facts. They're just giving some facts, and and those some facts might not even be actual facts. It might just be stuff they're making up. So it's very important to check the credibility of anything stated on any mainstream media nowadays because it's just so far out. It's mind-blowing how far out it is. The deforestation actually has dropped quite a bit. It could still be lower, that we could still get to a point where there's no deforestation, but it's not. The deforestation rate is a lot less than it was like in 2010 or earlier.
Yeah, and it's also been going around that the Amazon produces 20% of the world's oxygen. It was in the CNN clip, and the French president also tweeted that out, but that is not correct. I'm not sure what the exact number is, but it's definitely not 1/5 of the world's oxygen, just so you know. So a geologist, Gregory Wrightstone, published an article in the Epoch Times explaining why he thinks there are problems with the data. So he said that the satellite fire data that they referenced only goes back to 2013. That's Brazil's data. So that's not enough data to really say whether it's record-breaking or not. And according to NASA's Global Fire Emissions Database, which goes back to 2003, the overall numbers are pretty much in line with historic data. So according to the geologist, fires are set intentionally during the dry season, which is now, because it's difficult to set fires when it's damp, and they use it to regenerate and maintain farmland or pasture. It's estimated that up to 15% of the original forest has been cleared by burning, but most of that happened in the 90s and 2000s, so conservation efforts have really slowed down the deforestation, which is a good thing. So the Amazon is definitely important, and taking care of the planet is obviously important, but promoting these alarmist stories to scare people and confuse people doesn't benefit anybody. So, because if you're afraid, then you can't really think rationally or make good decisions. So the moral of the story is whenever there are headlines that try to scare us, we should really be mindful of what they're saying, and if it really is an issue or if there's an agenda behind it, and find out what you can actually do about it.
Right. I mean, I won't doubt that there'll be articles in the future that will be scary and true, but for now, it's best to kind of just check their sources and find other sources and try to make your own judgments based on the actual facts and not what we're hearing from a lot of these media outlets anymore.
So what do you think about the Amazon fires? You can let us know at our America Daily Facebook page. Once again, I'm Jessica.
And I'm Matt. We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to America Daily.
This is America Daily, bringing you the best in truthful news updates and in-depth reports happening now.